Imagine a dark place where the sun never shines. The only illumination is a permanent twilight, the source of light never appearing in the sky or even peeking over the horizon. The sky would be a perfect blend of oranges, yellows, and light reds at the skyline, fading into a lighter blue, then into a deep indigo. Perpetual shadows would stretch out into your surroundings, and fire would not only be needed for warmth, but also as a light source. The place I am describing is called St. Martin's Land, and its inhabiting humans all have green skin.
There have been reports of strange creatures in the area.
Witnesses say they couldn't believe what they were seeing.
What is that? Welcome, beloved fofers, doubters, naysayers, non-believers, and skeptics. Welcome to Paranormal Fable or Fact. I am Victor Trevino, joined by my co-host and beautiful wife, Tammy.
We are your humble guides for tales of alleged blah, 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 blah.
I'm leaving that in.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am.
Don't.
Do it over again.
We are... Okay, let's go. Ready? We are your humble guides to tales of alleged hoaxes, unbelievable stories, and the overall strange.
Sweet. Perfectly done as usual.
Yeah, okay.
Have to mention the email, the Facebook, and our YouTube channel. Take the time to check them out. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Our email is pfableorfact@proton.me. And I have to make a correction from a way back when show, baby. I mean, way back when. Well, I think it's episode 4. The Enfield, the ventriloquist poltergeist. About the Enfield poltergeist. One of my critics, while I was doing research in my genius, I came across another case that interested me, automatically caught my eye. I've always had my doubts about this case. I don't want to go too much into it, but one of the criticisms I had is, why didn't they videotape all this evidence that they're describing? I mean, if all this fantastic stuff's happening, grab a camcorder, right? Well, they didn't have camcorders back then. Just like with the Enfield poltergeist, which occurred in 1977, and lasted, I think, until 1978, they didn't have camcorders until 1983. And even those, the public really probably didn't start using them like, a lot until probably, 85, 86 maybe?
Yeah, probably.
So that's why. And during the Enfield poltergeist, remember, one of my criticisms was the girls supposedly were being picked up and thrown across the room.
Yeah.
And they caught photographs of them. And when you look at a still photograph, it just looks like a little girl jumping from one bed to the other. Yeah. Right, remember?
Yeah.
And my... Remember?
Yes.
And my criticism was, why didn't they videotape it? Well, that's why. That's why. So I had to make the correction. Again, I don't mind one bit correcting myself if I'm wrong about something. I just wanted to throw that out there. So, and then when we do the other show in the future, the one I'm doing the research on now, we'll talk about that as well. So let's move on to the rules. Rule number 1. We will never purposefully mislead or report false information ever.
Rule number 2, we are not professional podcasters, broadcasters, or audio editors, so mistakes will happen.
Rule number 3, everyone is entitled to believe what they want and entitled to their own opinions, including us.
Rule number 4, we are offering information and insight as food for thought, not persuasion.
All right, so let's move on to the gist. I've been kind of chewing it. Actually, I chew it the bit for every show, baby, because I just love this stuff. I really do. This one has fascinated me for quite some time. Because when I first heard it, I heard it years ago, babe. I'm talking like when I was in high school, I heard it. And even back then, it was like, it's just an old wives' tale. It's just legend, myth, just like when you were growing up and you were hearing the Pied Piper of Hamlin and all this other kind of stuff. There's nothing to that. It's all just stories or whatever. Well, now that we have the means to do research, our own research, you start to find out more stuff. So I was like, wait a minute here. So then I started digging deeper, and that's how we got the show. So this show is called Green Agnes, and it's about the green children of Woolpit. Now, Woolpit is a small town in Suffolk, England, or the UK. And in Old English, it's pronounced Wolfpite, I believe. I'm probably butchering that, but I think Old English is a dead language now, so it's not like anybody's going to correct us. It's an ancient village, and it's named after the old pits that they used to dig in the area to catch wolves and other animals. So they not only use it to control the amount of wolves that are in the area for their livestock, but they also used it to hunt, like deer and stuff like that. They'd fall in these deep pits, and then the villagers would go over there and use spears to kill it, and then they would drag it out of the hole and eat it and skin it, whatever they're going to do with it. Well, in or around 1150 AD, a group of villagers came across two young children. They were striking in appearance because right off the bat they had green skin.
Green skin?
Green skin, like goblins or something.
Ooh.
They were speaking gibberish, and that's a very strong point. We have to remember that because that's one of the points of contention that we're going to make later, that they were speaking gibberish. They were acting extremely nervously, and they were wearing clothes that, quote, were of a strange hue. I would have to say probably a color that wasn't available at the time, maybe a dye, because remember, dyes weren't really available like they are now. People didn't wear like fluorescent colors and stuff back then. They didn't have the means to make those dyes. So most of the clothing was very drab,
Yeah.
Mostly brown, or the natural color of whatever they were using. Like if they were wearing cotton clothes, you would have that kind of off-white.
Right.
If you were using wool, it would be like beige color,
Yeah.
Leather would be brown, stuff like that.
Right.
They didn't really use a lot of dyes, so for them to take note that their clothing was a strange hue, that caught my attention. I thought that was pretty interesting. The boy was younger than his sister, and he was sickly when they were found. Since the children didn't speak English, the villagers had no way of communicating with them. But instead of leaving them out there in the cold, they brought the kids to town, and they went to live with a knight. I didn't know he was a knight. And he was living in the village, and his name was Richard de Calne. After a few days of completely refusing any food that was offered to them, the children were, I guess, walking with their caretakers into the market, and they saw raw broad beans, which are basically kind of like lima beans from what I can tell. But they call them broad beans. It might be a different, style of bean or whatever. Yeah. But they were green, and these kids rushed over to this basket of raw beans and just started wolfing down these beans. So that's what they started feeding them. Well, eventually they got them weaned off of the bean diet, and started eating people food and started dressing more like the locals. And eventually they learned how to speak, the local languages and stuff. And they were baptized, and right after they were baptized, the boy wound up dying of whatever illness he had. The girl slowly adjusted to her new life, learned to eat other foods, learned to speak English, lost her green coloring, and eventually became a house servant to Richard. And that's basically the gist.
The green wasn't from the beans?
No. They were green when they were found. I mean, that's why it was such a big story,
Yeah.
So, we're moving on to the red flags. This all happened during the reign of King Stephen, in a rather tumultuous time in England's history. It's referred to as the Anarchy in the mid-12th century. The heir to the English throne, basically what happened in that, and I don't know I didn't write down the dates or anything, but basically I looked up what the Anarchy meant, and the true heir to the English throne was lost at sea by some crazy shipwreck or whatever. And that caused a huge conflict in all the area, including Normandy, the indigenous Welsh, what was called the Angevine Empire, in England. And they all started fighting because, I don't know if it's because they didn't see King Stephen as the true king or something. I don't know what happened, but it caused strife. Maybe the king that was lost in the ocean was supposed to marry somebody, and
yeah, maybe. I don't remember ever hearing about a King Stephen, and I like learning about the kings and queens.
Well, maybe we should do shows on royalty and stuff in the future.
Maybe
we could. So this occurred during the Dark Ages, and this is the next red flag, because the Dark Ages, I guess now they're like being debated. There's some people that are denying that the Dark Ages is an accurate. You know what the Dark Ages is, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Were you expecting me to explain it?
Yes,
Oh,
I
no,
was.
I'm not going to explain it.
Okay, well, basically, it's a blackout of, well, not a complete blackout, but a definite fall in the amount of art, recorded history, records, etc., etc. That's why they call it the Dark Ages, because information during this time is very sparse. So the few amount of references that we have about this story might be influenced by that fact. The thing is with the point of contention is some people are saying, well, it's not really a blacking out. I believe it was because there were so many wars and stuff. And what happens when you conquer a kingdom?
Stuff gets destroyed.
You're going to destroy stuff.
Yeah. And
there was so much war going on. I mean, right now we're talking about this. This is a war I never even heard of, the anarchy phase. Right. And we know that England was involved in a war with France for, what was it, like over 100 years or something? Some crazy. And that was like all the way up until like the late 1700s, early mid 1800s or something. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there was a lot of wars going on, and as countries were being formed and kingdoms were being formed and they were conquering each other, they were destroying, especially if a Christian, like the Romans, when they were Christian, they were taking over these pagan, civilizations, they were destroying all the pagan stuff, and vice versa. If the pagans took over a Christian establishment, they destroyed all the right. Christian doctrine and all that.
All the relics.
That's what you did, because you didn't believe in what they believed, so that was part of war, right. The spoils or whatever. So I think that's attributes to some of the Dark Ages. Not to go off on a complete tangent there, but as we usually do. But anyway, I looked up natural causes for possible explanations for why these kids had green skin. Okay? Not a lot of information on this. It's not something that you can find that happens often. There was an ancient historical disease or a condition called chlorosis, or the green sickness. Now, the reason it's a historical condition is because there's references to it in the old medical manuals and stuff way back when, but modern medicine has never detected it. So it's kind of like a theorized disease or condition.
Okay.
Because we don't have it now.
Right.
Basically, it was pretty much, from what they could find, it's mostly for young women. And it affects the women's faces. They get a green tinge on their face, particularly around their eyes. Theories, they're saying it might have been like some kind of hypochromic anemia, which is often associated with a poor diet, or gastric ulcerations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then there's this other theory that it might have been like a pseudomonas infection, which is like a bacterial organism that can make wounds appear green. Have you ever had that, where you get a scab and it's like a greenish color?
Yeah.
That's what they're saying it might be, but the kids weren't scabs, so
they didn't.
But this is just
describe them like that.
This is just describing how humans can have a green tinge to their skin.
Okay.
Also, it doesn't necessarily, for this infection, the green color doesn't necessarily indicate infection, so the wound would be cleaned thoroughly as an infection could develop. Another cause of green skin is exposure to copper, certain drugs, green dyes, green tattoos, and stuff like this, which are more like your environment or stuff that you're actually doing.
But a tattoo would be permanent.
Right.
It wouldn't go away.
You wouldn't tattoo somebody's whole body. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying. They wouldn't slowly lose their green tinge because that would be permanent, right? I don't think this is. This is just the research I did of why possible explanations to why.
Got you.
This isn't skeptics coming forward and saying, "Oh, this explains what they're saying." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is just my own research.
Gotcha.
And I was particularly interested in exposure to copper because one of the theories is they might have been from underground. But we'll move on. We'll talk about that more.
Like a copper mine.
Right, or something. And we'll talk about that more with Inarguable Truth number 1. Now, moving on to the next red flag. Well, point of interest. Near contemporary accounts to this occurrence, to these kids being found, were contained primarily in 2 works. I think there's a third, but it was barely mentioned. One of them is William of Newburgh's Historia Rerum Anglicarum, which is the history of English affairs, and that was written in 1189, which is only 30 years after this happened. Well, almost 40 years after this happened. And the second was from Ralph of Coggeshall's Chronicum Anglicanum in 1220, which is about 70 years after this happened. Both men wrote about the Green Children as though it had significance. William of Newburgh, and this is going back to the first guy, he wrote about King Stephen's tyranny, classic English revenants, which were like zombies. It's based on revenant is based on an old French word meaning returning or coming back. So like a ghost zombie is basically what they were when I was looking them up, because revenant is used in different games, but they're usually like ghosts or specters or something like that. But I guess in the old English belief was they were like zombies of some type, somebody that was returning or coming back. He wrote these and recorded the arrival of the Green Children as warnings for local prosperity. And even though William himself wrote that the findings of his sources were doubtful, historians later found evidence that he admitted he was compelled to believe this story.
Oh.
So when he talks about sources, he actually went to Woolpit and interviewed people. And when he was doing his interviews, she supposedly, the girl who survived and was, had married and everything, she was living 30 miles away from where he was, or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. It's contemporary. This isn't 200 years later or whatever, and she's already long gone.
Right.
The other one is this Ralph of Coggeshall. He was first a monk, and afterwards he became the 6th abbot.
Abbot?
The 6th abbot from 1207 to 1218 AD of Coggeshall Abbey. The English Chronicles, and this is what his work was chronological order, stories, and anecdotes that he had heard at the time, and he didn't bother listing his references, which is significant. He was writing all these stories and all these things that he was hearing, but didn't bother, giving the references. He also wrote about Prince John and King Henry this way, but when he wrote the story of these Green Children, he listed his sources.
Well, that's interesting.
Very interesting.
Especially since he wasn't going to use resources or sources for Prince John and Henry II. That's royalty.
Right. So it's kind of like a casual writing.
Yeah,
just maybe like musings or whatever.
Right.
But when he wrote about them, he actually listed the sources. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Today, and this is significant, today, Woolpit's population is still under 2,000.
Oh, it's an actual place still?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's a tiny little town. I mean, baby, 2,000, that's like 2,000 people living there. That's like one gas station.
Yeah. It's
one
tiny.
Convenience store.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Possibly a supermarket, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a tiny little town. But we'll talk about that more because I believe that's significant. We'll talk about that more because we're going to talk about it in Arguable Truth number 3. Luckily, I leave those notes for myself so I don't just start going off,
Yeah.
After learning to speak English, the girl started telling people about her home, where her and her brother came from, and she called it St. Martin's Land, like the intro was talking about. And she described everything there was green. The sun never shined, and the available light was like twilight. And I had to look up twilight because it's not a term we use. It's like dusk. It's like right when the sun is just setting, it's still bright enough to see, but there's no direct sunlight.
Ah, yeah.
So it would be like this backlighting.
Right.
Which is really weird.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And she said it was always like that. So it was never dark, it was never light, it was just always twilight, which is, I think, significant. Her and her brother had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise like numerous bells of an abbey. Because, see, she probably heard the bells later, working as a servant to Richard, and that's what she described it as. It was close to the sound of bells. They had followed one of the cattle, I guess it's wandered off, and they followed it into a cave and had become lost. And then, guided by these bells, they found themselves standing by the wolf pit.
Wow, that's interesting.
She also described a large river that ran through their lands, which means it might have been possibly subterranean, which is what I was talking about before. They might come from underground, and if they did, if there was copper in the area, maybe that's why they had green skin.
Could be.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll talk about that more anyway. Because remember, baby, there have been vast subterranean establishments, human establishments, discovered all over the world for defense against invasion and also safety from prosecution.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that more in our Argument Truth number 3. According to records, and this is William, this is the first writer, he said that the girl, the locals referred to her as very wanton and impudent. And I had to look up those terms because we don't really use them today. Wanton means very flirtatious, very forward. I don't, but more of a sexual way, like a prostitute would be wanton. Hey baby, you want, very forward.
Yeah.
And impudent means that she didn't have any respect for people around her. So what a wanton behavior of a wanton, impudent woman would be was like if you and I go to a diner and we're sitting there together, and here comes the waitress, she sits on my lap and starts playing with my hair.
And she's going to get knocked out.
Right. No, knowing that you're my wife, having no respect for our marriage, or you know what I'm saying. That's how a wanton, impudent woman would behave like.
Okay.
And according to William, she eventually married a man from King's Lynn, which was about 40 miles from. I said 30 miles.
Yeah.
Which was about 40 miles from Woolpit, which was about 64 kilometers from Woolpit. And at the time, she was still living shortly before he wrote that work. And based on his research into Richard de Colna's family history, the astronomer and writer Duncan Lunan had concluded that the girl was given the name Agnes, and she had married a royal official named Richard Barr. And apparently that's still talked about, so it's been vetted. I couldn't find any evidence of it, and I think you did like genealogy on it, and you couldn't find any.
No.
But we're talking about the 1100s, baby, I'm not surprised that you weren't able to find anything.
Yeah.
Because what kind of records were being kept back then,
Well, plus you said it was during the Dark Ages. Some of that stuff's destroyed, probably.
Exactly. So let's move on to the next red flag, which is, we're getting into the explanations now. These are possible theories by people put forth. I already talked about the underground theory,
right,
where they might have been from underground. Another one is that the story is pure folklore. Nothing honest about it, nothing true about it. The locals were basically just talking about this fantastic tale of imaginary inhabitants of some kind of fairy world. Now, my response to that would be, well, that's fine, except that there was a surviving quote-unquote fairy, right?
Right.
So that just kind of, I don't know. I don't want to argue with it because this is historians' theory, so...
Yeah.
But, some skeptics latch on to those theories and they start talking in the chat rooms that I like to go to and stuff. And I'm reading it and I'm like, bro, she wasn't imaginary.
Yeah.
I mean, they described her personality. They described the clothing they were wearing. They described where she lived. She served as a servant there. She married somebody. You know what I mean? It wasn't a fairy tale.
She married a royal official.
Right.
Not just a average Joe.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So moving on to the next explanation, possible explanation, is that it is a, quote, a garbled account unquote, of a real event. And that means something actually happened, but they just screwed it all up, because of the whole telephone game. Somebody repeats the tale and it starts to change. And whether the story is an authentic report given by children, like a child's tale, or an adult invention, is hard to ascertain. But again, my response to that is, if they're trying to get attention or notoriety, or build some kind of reputation or whatever, that doesn't stand true even today, and we'll get into that more in Inarguable Truth number 2.
Okay.
The next explanation. It's a story about an oblique account of racial differences between the English and the indigenous Britons. This to me is a dumb one. I only put it in here because it's one of them out there. To me, this is more like one of those woke things, where they're trying to say it was racist and discriminatory and all this. So basically, in other words, the story was made up at the perfect time. Vast immigration was happening, and the English told the story to make themselves seem more accommodating. Look how great we are. We even accept people with green skin.
But it doesn't seem like that city grew very big for immigration.
Thank you very much. If there's thousands of immigrants coming into that area, why is Woolpit still only 2,000 people?
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. So, like I said, that one's kind of weak, and I don't really accept that one. And this is another one that's because it's way out there. Another contemporary theory, possible explanation, is that the children may have been aliens. Now, here's a trippy thing. I didn't write down the guy's name because I think it was like a comedian or a celebrity that went in the area and he was asking around. And he found locals that claimed to be relatives of Agnes. But no one would tell him who. So the people there are like, oh yeah, they're still descendants of her around here. Well, who? And they're no.
Yeah, they just don't want to be recognized. They want to have a private life.
Again, not seeking some kind of recognition or fame or whatever that other explanation was saying. Exactly, they're very secretive.
Yeah.
The story of entering into a different reality, and this is another kind of an explanation. The story of entering into a different reality by way of a cave seems to have been quite popular around that time. The medieval historian Gerald of Wales tells a similar story of a boy who was truant from school, who encountered two pygmies who led him through this vast underground passage into this beautiful land of fields and rivers, but it was not lit by the full light of the sun. But from everything I could find, maybe that story was written after the Children of Woolpit. So to me, that argument kind of womp womp, you know what I mean? It kind of falls short.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing, and again, sort of a explanation that some historians are throwing out there, because apparently beans in many cultures are associated with death. And broad beans in particular had been the symbol of death and corruption since ancient times. They were also associated with the opposite phenomena, such as rebirth and fertility. So these beans were very significant in ancient folklore, basically is what they're saying. So that thrown in there, they're saying is evidence of it being a fairy tale, but...
That's strange.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a stretch.
Yeah.
I would have to say. That's a stretch. So another thing that fascinated me is there have been so many numerous writings about this incident over the centuries. It even inspired poems, books, stories, documentaries, that I would argue something had to have happened. Something that was much bigger than some kind of figurative or romantic or fairy tale or metaphoric story, in my humble opinion. And we'll talk about that more in Inarguable Truth number 4. So now we get to the Inarguable Truths, baby. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Inarguable Truth number 1.
A person with a green face would not be referred to as a green person.
Inarguable Truth number 2.
Little effort was made to capitalize on the legend by the locals even today.
Inarguable Truth number 3.
The information traveled very fast for such an isolated small town.
Inarguable Truth number 4.
Despite numerous historians and authors dismissing it, The story is still studied today.
Inarguable truth number 5. The children spoke a language so unknown that it was described as gibberish. Inarguable truth number 6.
If the green skin was a symptom of a disease, unknown or otherwise, others would have suffered from it.
Okay, let's go back to inarguable truth number 1, which is a person with a green face would not be referred to as a green person. This is just basic common sense. And this is going back to that reference where they might have been suffering from that green sickness, which was basically isolated around the face, and it was basically isolated to just young women.
Right.
And it was primarily around the eyes. If someone had green around their eyes, you would say, oh man, that's old Nellie Green Eyes or something. You wouldn't say,
yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You wouldn't call her green-skinned.
Yeah.
So they had to have green skin. Their entire bodies had to have a greenish tinge to it. And it had to be so noticeable that the story became famous, right?
Right.
If someone, particularly if they're saying it was an old disease that doesn't, or I keep saying disease, a condition that doesn't exist today, the people would have known about it.
Right.
They would have known, girls sometimes get green around their mouths or green around their eyes. It wouldn't have been such a well-traveled, well-documented story. They wouldn't have kept records about it all this time.
Right. If it was like a common deficiency, they would have not really talked about it.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Also, you have to remember the children were also wearing clothing of what was called an odd hue. I would argue it's probably green. Because remember, when Agnes was describing her homeworld, she said everything was green. Everything.
Yeah.
So that means their skin was green and their clothing would have been green. And to the locals, I don't know how popular green dye was. I didn't do that research. I should have. But I don't know how popular green dye was back then. I don't know how readily available it would have been to people back in the 1100s. It might not have been.
Yeah, probably not.
But who knows? I don't know. So it wasn't just the green skin. It was also their clothing. Their clothing was odd looking to where they were like, whoa, who are these kids?
Right. That would be like if you took a 80s kid in neon and put him in the 1920s.
Right.
You know what I mean? It was
Right.
just like, whoa, what's
Totally
going on?
out of space where people were looking at them going, whoa, not just because of the green skin, but also the way they were dressed. And they couldn't speak English,
Yeah.
which was very odd. So I think we covered that one enough.
Yeah. Like Back to the Future.
But that's just my only argument is it can't be something that was common or something that was common back then or something that was just basically localized around the face.
Right.
People wouldn't have referred to them. They would have said green-faced kids.
Right.
Minimally, not green-skinned. Moving on to inarguable truth number 2, little effort was made to capitalize on the legend by locals even today. We were just talking about this, how they're kind of secretive about it. They're not trying to get notoriety or any kind of reputation or fame by telling the story. You see what I mean? And
Yeah.
if you think about how small it is today, that means it's not a big tourist trap. You know what I mean? They're not like trying to capitalize to bring people in.
Yeah. They're
About
not
the
like
story.
having a Green Kid Day or something.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. They're not like, even though there is like little shops that probably mention it or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
that's not the intent.
Right.
So if the argument that they were trying to do that back then, I think falls short
Yeah.
because they're still not doing it today. So
It kind of reminds me of like when you have like a relative and you're like, no, I'm really not related to that relative.
yeah, they're embarrassing. Yeah, it's
You
like
know?
it's something you want to hide.
Yeah, you're
you know?
like, yeah, that's not mine.
And that's what I wrote here. It seems to me, this is just my opinion, it seems to me that this is like an occurrence that happened that the locals just kind of want to forget about.
Yeah, like they're embarrassed or
Yeah,
just-
because they know it makes it sound weird, or they know that it opens them up to criticism.
yeah.
People are calling them, oh, you're making up stories, you're trying to make yourselves look good, so they just don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, they just leave it alone.
And even, like I said, that guy was asking around, and that he found out that, there's still descendants of Agnes around here. And he's like, well, who? And they wouldn't tell him.
Right.
So, moving on to inarguable truth number 3, and I think this is a pretty significant one. The information traveled very fast for such an isolated small town. And again, going back to that reference, it's only 2,000 people today. Can you imagine how tiny it was back then? Because even then, it's described as a small town.
Yeah.
So I don't even know what 2,000 people is that's like a one-horse town today. I can't even imagine what it would have been back then.
Yeah.
There's probably only 100 people there or something, 50 people or something. Maybe, 6, 7 families perhaps? So to me, the way that it spread, because, and I should have wrote it down, but that abbot, the guy that came, he was like all the way across England. He had to travel mile, and I guess he was like a traveling abbot or whatever, because remember, at first he was a monk, so I guess he was traveling or whatever. He came from a long ways away and found out about this story, so people were still talking about it. He wrote that in 1220.
Yeah.
That's almost 80 years after it happened, and people were still talking about it.
Right.
So something significant, to me, that means...
Well, like I was going to say, that means 80 years. That means Agnes was probably gone by then.
Right.
She
After
was
her death.
Deceased, yeah.
But remember, the other guy, William, she was still alive. And that was in 1189. So this is 30 years after what William wrote. That's when Ralph of Coggeshall showed up and recorded his stories. It was 80 years. That means, yeah, you're right. She's probably already dead. That, to me, leans towards there being... It's not... It couldn't have just been a fairy tale. One could argue, well, other stories survived and nothing significant happened. Yeah, but those were mostly cautionary tales that still apply to this day. If you think of, like, for example, perfect example is Little Red Riding Hood. That story is still told today. Because what's the message? Don't trust strangers. Right? That still applies today.
Yes.
So the story has survived all this time as a cautionary tale that you would tell to your children.
Right.
When somebody asks you where you're going, don't just trust them outright. You have to be careful.
Right.
Cautionary tale. That's why it survived. This is not a cautionary tale by any stretch of the means. This is just a relating of something that occurred. I mean, where's the caution in it?
There is none.
There is none. So to me, for it to survive this long is evidence something actually happened. And we're going to go into more detail because my main theory, because I only saw a few people talking about this, and I came up with it myself, of them coming from underground. Because we don't know what's underground.
No.
It's just like when we talk about the ocean. We know that there's no way we have any knowledge of what goes on in the ocean or what lives in the ocean.
Right.
We have an idea. We have a collective idea of samples we have collected and things of this nature, but we don't know every species in the ocean. There's no way.
No.
Because we haven't even explored all of the ocean.
Correct.
Particularly when you get into the depths, way, way down there.
So it could be the same of being underground. We don't know everything that's going on underground.
Right. I think the deepest hole, and it was a very tiny hole, I think the deepest hole we've ever dug, and we talked about this before on another show. I think it was the People versus Sasquatch. We were talking about the hole in Russia where they dug like 8 miles down or something.
Right.
But it was just a tiny little hole, like, the size of a drill bit.
Yeah.
And they estimate that the Earth's crust is 37 miles thick. So we're barely scratching the surface of what's under us.
Right.
We have no idea. It's all theory. So now remember, talking about subterranean stuff, because I made reference to it earlier in the show, of human civilizations that were built underground. We're going to move to what's called Cappadocia, which is in Turkey. It's an underground city that was discovered. It's 100 square miles with over 200 underground villages. It's complete with hidden passages, secret rooms, and ancient temples. And it has a remarkable history of each new civilization building on the work of the last. So in other words, it was continuously being worked on as different generations discovered it and continued building on it. And it makes Cappadocia one of the world's most striking and large cave-dwelling regions in the entire world. And this is in Turkey. The Gadara Aqueduct is another one. It's an ancient aqueduct that was built to supply water to the Roman Hellenistic Decapolis. Yeah, Decapolis, I guess is how you would say it. Which now lies in Syria and Jordan. And these are vast underground works that were done way back when. Now, I'm not just talking about foreign countries. Well, what are you talking about? We're talking about the UK here, buddy.
Yeah.
You better be able...
No, there's caves
There's
there
tunnels
too.
in the UK
Yeah.
called the underground caves of Nottingham. These are below the streets of Nottingham, England. Nearly 500 man-made caves are cut into the natural sandstone. Over the centuries, they have been used for a vast array of purposes, including dungeons, beer cellars, cesspits, tanneries, malt kilns, houses, wine cellars, tunnels, summer houses, air raid shelters, which came way later. That was like you're talking World War II, baby. Air raid shelters, sand mines, and jails. Most famously, one of them was said to have held Robin Hood.
Robin Hood's real?
I think so. You should do a show on that.
Yeah.
There you go, Robin Hood. I'll write it down. So the point is there are underground tunnels that were dug from the surface down back when. Why couldn't they dig deeper? The passage was never discovered, and these people were living underground, and that's where these kids came from.
Yeah.
And it would explain why their skin was green if, like I said, if there was copper deposits there and these people are always exposed to copper, what if, over the years it turned their skin green?
Yeah.
And that's why when she's talking about, well, everything's green down there,
right.
All the people are green, that's what she's talking about.
Right. And she said there's no sun, and the copper could, make a
right.
hue.
Maybe they had little tiny air holes that where the light shined down or something.
On the copper.
Or maybe the copper, so I don't know.
Yeah, who knows?
Or maybe they had some kind of lighting that was in the distance that they used. I don't know.
Well, and it's very fascinating because, we still have, even in America, we have tons of tunnels and mines and all kinds of stuff. And then, our ancestors, they used to put, because it would get hot, they would put all their products, their food products underground to keep them cool.
To keep them cool, huh?
Yeah, because they didn't have refrigerators like we do now.
Exactly.
They didn't have no Frigidaires.
Exactly. So, even though it's far-fetched, I realize this, but to me it's feasible. That's a feasible argument, and that's why it was so significant, because they had no idea where these kids came from. But we're going to get into that in more detail. We're not done.
Okay.
Moving on to inarguable truth number 4. Despite numerous historians and authors dismissing it, the story is still studied today. That is compelling, baby. People are still interested in it. People are still talking about it. We're talking about it. We're doing this podcast on it. The definition of a historian is an expert in or a student of history, especially that of a particular period, geographical region, or a social phenomenon. So again, not bashing the historians, they're just doing their jobs. This is what they're supposed to do. And they're still talking about it today. They're still debating about it today, baby. So it's still significant.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very interesting. Some
contend that it inspired the story of the Babe in the Woods, which is a fairy tale. I don't know. The Babe in the Woods, to me, I would think inspired the story of Hansel and Gretel, because it's closer to that story. These two kids get abandoned out in the woods because their evil stepmother doesn't want them, and
yeah, I've never heard of the Babes in the Woods.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Well, in the Babe in the Woods fairy tale, they both die.
Oh.
Whereas in Hansel and Gretel, they get captured by that witch, and she's trying to eat Hansel, and they outsmart her because he keeps giving her a bone, and she thinks, oh, he's not fat enough. So she keeps yelling at Gretel, oh, keep feeding him food. I want him fattened up so she could eat him. And Gretel winds up pushing her in the oven and killing her. And then the kids grab all her money and gold, and they run home to their dad, and they live happily ever after. So, but to me, it's more along those lines. This isn't kids being abandoned out in the woods. These kids were taken in and taken care of. So I don't know if I agree with that. But that's what some historians claim. Mm. So moving on to inarguable truth number 5. The children spoke a language that was so unknown that it was described as gibberish. This is a very significant one, baby, because there were so many different languages spoken in the UK at the time. I mean, you're talking about French, Welsh, Gaelic, Gaelje, I believe.
Sure.
Well, because Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelige are different. They're similar, but they're different.
Okay.
And I hope I'm not insulting anybody by saying that, but I think they are pretty similar languages. So you had the Scottish and the Irish languages. You had Norse, and you had Latin. And then because some of the claims were that Flemish were immigrating at the time, and these kids were probably Flemish, and because this area was so isolated, they didn't understand the language. So they were just Flemish immigrant children that had gotten separated from their parents or whatever, and that's it. That's the explanation, you know. But hold on.
Okay.
Put the brakes on there, fella. Because my argument, after I started doing research on that claim, the Flemish had been migrating into England since the Norman conquest for nearly 100 years by the time this story occurred in 1150. So the Flemish would have been well established in the area, you know, because you had merchants and stuff.
And somebody would have understood.
Somebody would have, well, maybe not even spoke the language, but at least recognized it.
Yeah.
And not described it as gibberish, is my argument.
Yeah.
That's why the inarguable truth is they described it as gibberish. They had no idea what these kids were talking about.
Right.
Even though all those different languages were spoken in the area. So they probably went door to door. Hey, do you understand what these kids are saying?
Right.
Hey, you speak Latin. Do you understand what these kids are saying? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you're French. Do you
Looking for
understand
an interpreter.
Seeing if anybody could figure out what these kids were saying. Everybody was like, we have no idea what that language is. The idea that nobody recognized Finnish is nonsense. They'd been coming in for over 100 years.
Right.
They would have been well established by then. You're talking about, what is that, 4 generations?
Yeah.
Come on. To think that they're...
Almost 5.
Almost 5. So the idea that just because they were remote, that none of them, even though these merchants that went to the main cities in the area and traveled and met all kinds of people...
Correct.
The idea that none of them would have recognized this language and described it as gibberish, to me, is profound. And it is a very strong argument to this, to me, a dismissive explanation. They were just Flemish immigrant children, and the people back then were dumb. They didn't know who they were, and that's all it was.
Yeah.
Doesn't touch on why they had green skin.
No.
Doesn't touch on why they had weird clothing.
No.
Doesn't touch on why they wouldn't eat human food, and they were just eating beans. Doesn't touch on why, when she grew up, she was so, what's the word? Loving?
Yeah. Flirtatious.
Flirtatious, there you go, that's a good one. Doesn't explain any of that.
No.
Doesn't explain how the kid just died. Well, people died all the time back then. I guess that's not a good argument. But that explanation to me is dismissive. And that's why I wanted to investigate. And to me, I don't think that's a good explanation for it. I think it falls short. Because, again, the Flemish had been immigrating for over 100 years.
Right.
Somebody would have recognized that language.
Yeah. It's kind of like the Minions. We don't know what the heck they're speaking.
Yeah, it's gibberish.
It's just gibberish. It's a little Spanish, a little English. I don't know.
Minions.
And that's what it reminded me of.
Can we get back to the show, please?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's what it reminded me of.
What does he say for the unicorn? Pakui?
Yeah,
Pakui.
Pakui.
He goes, Pakui. Now that you completely distracted me.
Okay. Number 6.
Inarguable truth number 6. If the green skin was a symptom of disease, unknown or otherwise, others would have suffered from it. This is the mic drop. You can't say it was some kind of, maybe it was some strain of a disease that doesn't exist, you know, and modern science isn't aware of it, and that's the explanation of why they had green skin. Well, if that's the case, then why didn't all the locals have it?
Right.
If it's a disease, what is it, a non-contagious disease? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, because like when people were immigrating to America, they brought disease, or they got disease from the people that were already here, because that's what happens.
And when people came from America, when they brought Native Americans to Europe, the Native Americans brought diseases that wiped out all kinds of Europeans.
Yeah, so you just can't.
Sacagawea and that other guy. What was the other? Not Geronimo, the other one.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter. Anyway, because that's what happens. You're
not immune to it.
You're not immune. You haven't built up your immunity to certain diseases that are regional.
Exactly.
You go into a new region and it wipes people out by the thousands. That would have happened.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the explanation of some kind of weird disease or them being aliens or anything like that is a good enough explanation for it. To me, it has to be something more tangible.
Especially since it went away with her. You know what I mean?
Right, it just faded away.
It just faded away.
How do you describe that? To me, that's evidence that, like I said, maybe they had exposure to copper underground.
Yeah, or a nutrition. I think it's something like
or maybe nutrition.
Yeah.
And it's weird that they would only eat
deficit
raw.
of nutrition.
It's weird that they would only eat raw beans, too.
Yeah.
Because if you're underground, you wouldn't want to light a lot of fires.
Oh, that's true.
It would eat up your oxygen.
Yeah, it would take your oxygen.
So you wouldn't, maybe they didn't cook food because they were underground. See what I mean?
Yeah.
There's stuff to consider is
Could
what I'm
you
saying.
imagine not being able to cook your food? Oh,
And maybe that's why the kid was sickly. They didn't have exposure to sunlight,
yeah.
which we know is bad. You don't want to do that. As a human, people need
That
the sun for
D.
vitamin D and all kinds of other stuff. Mm-hmm. But the argument that it was some kind of localized disease that these kids only had, well, why didn't they spread it to the locals? And why didn't the other locals get it? Or already have it to where when the kids migrated from somewhere else, people in that region didn't have it either. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So that's not a good enough explanation for me, because that was another explanation. They probably just had some kind of ailment that doesn't exist anymore. I don't think so.
And a disease like that, like a disease, like if you brought in a disease, two people bring in a disease, and you're saying that the city now, the town now is only 2,000. So if that was like how we said 50 to 100 people, two people coming in with the disease can knock out 50 to 100 people.
Probably would have wiped out the whole town.
Easily.
Exactly. The point is, when these kids were discovered with green skin, it wouldn't have been such a shock. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It
that's
wouldn't have
true.
had such a shock value where this story just spread like wildfire and people from all over were coming to investigate it. Even these two writers from that age, from the Dark Ages, that wrote it down in their works, in these collected works that they did, the monk, Ralph of Coggeshall, and William.
Right.
Something significant happened.
And they're still investigating it.
And they're still looking into it. In conclusion, baby, what do you think about the green children of Woolpit?
That is some children from underground world or something.
That's it?
It's a fascinating story. It's a very fascinating story, and it's funny because it can't be a fairy tale or a folklore because she was an actual person, and who she married was an actual person, and she married royalty.
You found records
Of him, I did.
in genealogy
Of him, I did.
that he actually existed.
Yes, that he existed. He was like even like a lord or something like that.
Yeah, you found Richard de Colna, didn't you?
Yes.
So these are real people.
Yeah, they're real people. So
unless they were just complete liars, like some of these skeptics, or even some of the skeptical historians tried to explain it as, well, they're just trying to get fame and fortune, so they made up the story. Well, she was right there. They were looking right at him.
Yeah.
They watched him. They went into the marketplace and they ate beans right in front of a bunch of people. People saw them. It was a tiny little town. Everybody knew they were there.
well, and they still say that there's descendants of Agnes.
And they still say that there's descendants in the area.
But
Exactly.
but the descendants don't want to be named. So you can't say it's for notoriety, blah, 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 or for fame. You know what I mean?
Right.
You can't say that. You can't say that it's a fake story because there's actual people.
That was the inarguable truth. Mm-hmm. So that's your conclusion. My conclusion is basically the same as what you said. I don't think they were immigrants.
No.
I don't think that they were aliens. No. I don't think they were fairies. I don't think it was a fairy tale. I don't think it was a lie. I think it actually happened. I think these kids, because when I first heard the story, baby, and I don't know if it's changed because of the Mandela effect or what, but remember, I told you I heard about this story when I was in high school. All the way back then, because I used to read all kinds of books. Man, I had so many books, baby. It's unreal. And I read about this story. From what I remember, they were digging a well, the locals. And when they dug down, it opened up into an underground cavern, and that's where they found the kids.
See, that would make more sense.
To me, that was the original story. But now, when you look up all the references that I saw, it didn't talk about none of it. They were found near the pits. Some of them say that they were in one of the wolf pits. But the wolf pits aren't that deep, baby. They're only like 10 or 12 feet deep, I think, something like that. They're not that deep. I mean, they're not that deep now. They filled in, you know, because of erosion or whatever.
Yeah.
But still, they're like 6 or 7 feet deep, I believe, most of them.
But who's to say?
But-
It could have been deep.
Right, but even if they were found in one of those pits, that's not anything that could be tied to subterranean stuff. Like I said, when I first read the original story, and I don't know if the story has changed. I don't know if they've done more research and maybe they found out that that was a complete fabrication or something. But I remember the original story was that the locals were attempting to dig a well. So they were digging way down and the ground collapsed into an underground cavern. And that's when they found the kids, that they were underground already, the kids, and they pulled the kids out, and that's why all of this became so famous, because they discovered them underground. I don't know. Maybe because of the research of William and Ralph, that they've said, no, there was no stories about them coming from underground or whatever, so they just said they were found by the wolf pits or whatever. I don't know. Or like I said, maybe it's the Mandela effect.
Yeah.
The Mandela effect, and the story just changed. I don't know, but that's the story I originally remember.
That's very interesting.
And that's why my theory has always been that they came from underground, because it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense that they ate raw food. It makes sense that their clothes were different, because maybe, I don't know, maybe exposure to copper can change your clothes different colors. I don't know.
Yeah.
It explains why their skin was green.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And why after they got out of being underground, it gradually faded, because they weren't exposed to copper anymore.
Or because they were getting vitamin D from the sun.
If they were an underground civilization from way back when, and they had been living under there for hundreds of years, who knows?
Yeah.
Because again, it's not far-fetched. There is evidence of underground civilizations all over the world. If they were down there long enough, perhaps they had their own language.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yep.
Is it so far-fetched?
Nope.
I would argue no. And that's basically my theory. I think they came from underground. Because again, we have no idea what's underground. There could be people living underground right now. We have no idea.
That's true.
How do we know? What is ground penetrating radar? How deep does it go?
I have no idea.
It don't go no miles. I know that. It probably only goes maybe, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But the point is that we rarely dig that deep. And when we do, we only dig it in certain spots. Even for oil, baby. We only go a mile down, 2 miles down.
Yeah.
We don't go that deep. If something is way down there and they dig deep enough, we have no idea what's going on down there.
Yeah.
Honestly.
We don't really have a fascination of going underground, right? We have a fascination of space. We have a fascination of water. But we don't really have a fascination of going deep into the earth.
Well, because it's unsafe. It's expensive. That's why we don't do stuff underground.
Yeah.
Same thing with underwater. It's not where we belong.
Right, but we have more of a fascination of going underwater than we do going underground.
Going under the ground, right. Because again, it's unsafe, baby. You can't just drill a big, deep hole. Plus, it could be harmful to the environment.
Right.
You could expose a gas pocket, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why it was so dangerous to be a miner back in the day. Miners died all the time.
Yeah.
Because it's a dangerous job to go digging underground.
Right.
That's why we live on top, where we belong. But that pretty much does it, baby.
Yes, it does.
So I'm going to be quiet, and I'm going to let you close the show.
Okay. Everybody, please check us out on YouTube. Check us out on Facebook. Send us an email. I think pretty soon we're going to be able to take callers soon. So check us out. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook. And thank you very much for listening, and have a great night.
Also in the comments, if you want to leave comments on YouTube to give us ideas for future shows, give us your feedback. Like I said, we're focusing more on YouTube now. So if you want to leave comments or even tell like a short story of your own, leave it on the comments. We'll read them, we'll respond, and good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.